Right, good afternoon, everyone. We'll make a start on the webinar now. My name's David Mellor from the Emergency Planning College, and I'll be speaking for about 35, 40 minutes, I would think, using the PowerPoint slides you see on the screen in front of you. To interact with me, you just need to go to that little green tab, top of the screen, hover over that, and then that'll reveal some more choices. Click on chat. That will open up and that will allow you to send text messages to me, questions or comments, observations. Please make sure you send them to all panelists so both I can see them and my colleague Richard can see them here. You won't see them on the screen, but when we get into the Q&A session in the last 20 minutes or so of the webinar, I'll do my best to address or answer all of the questions or points you make. So welcome. Really enthusiastic response to this webinar. 94 people have registered. Over 30 people have signed up to this first session at lunchtime. It suggests there's a real interest in meeting the needs of vulnerable adults or adults at risk in emergencies. As I say, my name is David Mellor. I'm an associate lecturer here at the Emergency Planning College. I'm also an independent chair of the Safeguarding Adults Board. For those of you who don't know what Safeguarding Adults Board is, it's the local mechanism for bringing together all of the partners involved in safeguarding vulnerable adults. That's the local authority, all the parts of the health economy, the police, the private and voluntary and independent sector, to make sure we've got the policies in place to protect vulnerable adults. Okay. The aims of the webinar today are shown on the screen, hopefully for you now. We're going to look at the UK guidance, which exists, quite recent UK guidance. We're going to do a brief analysis of international guidance and research. There isn't a vast amount of research on the needs of vulnerable people in emergencies, and most of that I've been able to find is from the USA. We'll spend quite a bit of time looking at some key case studies and trying to draw some lessons or issues out of those. I'm going to offer some challenges to our current arrangement, and hopefully that will help us to identify opportunities for making some improvements and hopefully hearing about good practice from yourselves in the plenary session, which will then follow. Hope that sounds okay. Okay, we'll start with the key UK guidance, which I'm sure everyone will be aware of. That's identifying people who are vulnerable in a crisis, which was published in 2008, 6 years old, and in other case a four-step approach, and you can see those 4 steps on the screen there. Firstly, building networks of organisations which are aware of vulnerable people. Then creating lists of organisations which themselves have lists of vulnerable people, and those organisations will include local authorities, various parts of the health economy, GPs, surgeries, for example, and then having in place data sharing protocols and activation triggers to share that information when it was necessary to share it in the event of an emergency. And it was hoped that working your way through 1, 2 and 3 there would then enable you to have a picture of what the scale of requirements to be planned for are. I guess a question which immediately comes up is how comprehensive, how full are the lists of the various organisations such as adult social care in the local authority, GP surgeries, etc. I'll come back to that. Okay, so that's the basis of the guidance. It predates a lot of the work that's been done on community resilience in the last 3 or 4 years, but I think identifying people is consistent with the community resilience strand of work. Identifying people focuses on those who are less able to help themselves in an emergency, whilst the focus of community resilience is on building resilient communities So that enables Category 1 responders and others to focus more on those who are less able to help themselves. And one would hope that resilient communities would be better able to support vulnerable members of the community. So I think the guidance, although it was written before community resilience really came to the fore, I think the two elements are entirely consistent. In addition to that, a new kid on the block, local health resilience partnerships. These were formed as part of the government's changes to the health service and came into being just over a year ago, and they're now part of the local resilience forum architecture at a local level, and they're intended to be local strategic forums to enable all parts of the health system to plan for emergencies. There's a strong emphasis on the health economy and the local authority collaborating effectively together. And after a year, I think it's probably a bit too early to say how effective they are. But I'd really be interested when we get into the plenary to hear how they're working in your area, what difference they're making, and whether the needs of adults at risk or vulnerable adults are forcing their way onto their agendas or not. So we're really interested to get some feedback from you on that in due course. So, some challenges to the UK guidance. It was published in 2008. That's not a long time ago. But it's my view, and I'm thinking now in my role as an independent chair of a Safeguarding Adults Board, a role I've fulfilled for the last 3 years, it's my view that the landscape of care for people with complex needs, for adults with complex needs, has changed significantly in those 6 years since the guidance was published. For a start, local councils are increasingly contracting out a lot of services to the elderly, to the private, voluntary and independent sector. We've seen the advent of personalised budgets, which have certainly got a lot of potential to empower people to make decisions about their own care and potentially save us all some money. But inevitably, it involves vulnerable people buying care from independent providers. And many of you will be aware with high-profile scandals such as the abuse at the Winterbourne View Hospital and the problems which were revealed by the Francis report into the management of Mid-Staff's Hospital. And these are leading to big changes. Winterbourne, as many of you will know, has led to a complete shift in the way in which we meet the needs of adults with learning disabilities, moving them from hospital settings, distance away potentially from their families and where they live, back to care in community settings in the local area. So some big changes taking place since Identifying People was published in 2008, and a perfect storm ahead. I don't know if you've seen the Local Government Association graph of doom, which predicts that the cost of social care will eventually exceed the local authorities' ability to meet it as we head into the next few years. Certainly the LGA, last time I looked, were forecasting a 16.5 billion funding gap between what local authorities are getting in by way of government grant and what they're spending, with the various pressures on them, including the demographic changes and the greying of the population. So this growing elderly population, together with shrinking budgets, are creating really difficult pressures on local authorities. And I think one thing we can say for definite is that more and more people with complex needs will be cared for in their own homes. And if you have a reread of the Identifying People who are vulnerable in a crisis guidance, you'll see there's quite a strong focus on people being cared for in care homes, in hospitals and other establishments. And in fact, we're going to be seeing more and more people with complex needs being cared for in their own homes or close to their own homes. So that potentially creates more of a complex problem for us as emergency planners, emergency management practitioners, as we're trying to work out how to protect vulnerable adults in the event of an emergency. So, question that I think is appropriate to ask is whether our UK guidance is actually fit for purpose. I'm not going to answer that. I'm going to leave that question hanging there for you to have a think about. What do you think? Do you think the guidance is fit for purpose? Do you think it's keeping pace with the facts on the ground? And a little warning note I'd strike is that if you think back to the 2001 foot and mouth outbreak, one of the real criticisms of the then Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food, or MAP for short, was that the response was too slow because the plans were based on the previous outbreak back in 1967, when the agriculture business was completely different to the way it looked in 2001. So it is really important that our guidance keeps pace with changes in the sector, keeps pace with the facts on the ground. So if I can leave that question with you, hanging there, is our guidance currently fit for purpose or not? Okay, I'm going to get into some case studies now. The first one is not an emergency, which fits under the Civil Contingencies Act, but it was an emergency. It was a disruption in care to a person called Gloria Foster, which some of you may well be aware of. I know there are some of the people who signed up for this webinar from Surrey, where Gloria lived and died, but she was an 81-year-old woman who lived alone, suffered from dementia, and she was completely reliant on 4 weeks a day from a private care company called Care 24 First, which trade when it was raided by the border agency, who were concerned that it employed a number of illegal immigrants. Border agency and the police let the various local authorities, including Surrey Council, know that they were carrying out the raid in advance, and a list of people who they provided services to, including self-payers like Gloria. So she funded her own care. And in an affluent county like Surrey, there are 40,000 people like Gloria funding their own care. So I'm not quite sure whether they would all be on the lists that we're encouraged to keep or not. But that list, including Gloria, was provided to Surrey County Council. But the local authority did not provide alternative arrangements for her to make sure her needs were met. Her needs weren't met. She was left for 9 days before she was discovered by the district nurse, and she died. Now, the Adult Safeguarding Board in Surrey carried out a serious case review, which they're required to do, where adults die in circumstances where agencies appear to have not worked effectively together to safeguard them. And they found that serious mistakes had been made by a social worker who'd failed to make contact with Gloria, despite the fact that she was on this list. And she made an assumption that as a self-funder she'd be able to make her own arrangements. But clearly that wasn't possible for Gloria. So as a result of the case, the local authorities put in place a provider failure protocol where a crisis disrupts. I would imagine that would be a really interesting document for anyone involved in emergency management to look at. I know that there's really close liaison in Surrey between the emergency planning team and adult social care, so they're well aware of the serious case review. I wonder how aware emergency planners across the country are aware of the serious case review. And I wonder whether they've seen this provider failure protocol from which we could all learn. My worry or concern would be that because I'm just getting some comments that my voice is fading, So I apologise for that. I'm keeping the handset as close as I can to my ear and my mouth, and I'll try and make sure I speak as clearly as possible. So apologies if you aren't hearing me as well as we would like. We've had some problems with the telephone system at the Emergency Planning College, and we've put a fix in place today, which I hope will work satisfactorily for you. My apologies, though, if you're not hearing me as clearly as you might. I guess the point I'm making here is, the question I'm asking here is, how well are the world's resilience and safeguarding connected? Again, I'll be really interested to hear your thoughts on that when we get to the plenary session. Okay, another case study here. This is a civil contingencies emergency. It involves two Margarets. One was 79 and one was 86. They lived next door to each other in Carlisle, and they drowned in the Carlisle floods in 2005. When the River Petrel burst its bank, Warwick Road, where they lived, was flooded. The floodwater was about a metre deep, and they drowned. The rest of the neighbours on their road were evacuated or self-evacuated. The question one is inevitably drawn to is, why were these two extremely vulnerable people not evacuated? We don't know. It may be that they were too frightened to answer their door when the knock came, or perhaps they were unable to get to their door quickly enough when the knock came. And as you can see there, the conditions in the part of Warwick Road they lived were very extreme, floodwater a metre deep. But the guidance says that it's the job of the Category 1 responders to focus on people who are less able to help themselves, which surely is a definition which would include the two Margarets. Now, I haven't been able to find out that much information about the case of the two Margarets, apart from press reports about the case and the inquest which was subsequently held, which determined that their deaths were accidental. But I'm just wondering whether when people die, when vulnerable adults die in emergencies, and questions are raised about the response of the effectiveness of the response effort, as in this case, should there be some kind of additional scrutiny over and above the inquest, rather like the serious case review that I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago in respect of Gloria? Okay, here's another case study just to emphasise the fact that we aren't just talking about elderly people when we're talking about vulnerable adults. Gloria was 81, the two Margarets were 79 and 86. Michelle Conroy here was 21 when she died. And she died in very heavy storms in near Exeter in 2012. Michelle was a rough sleeper. She'd been a looked-after child, had a difficult childhood and adolescence, and she'd not made the most successful transition to adulthood. So she was living on the streets, and on the night she died, she was sleeping in a tent with a couple of other people when a tree fell on her and killed her. She didn't use drugs. She didn't use alcohol. A really sad case. The inquest reported very recently, so you may have picked up details of the case. But I highlight Michelle's case because it emphasises the fact that vulnerable adults are a very wide group of people, not just elderly folks. And there are quite a lot of people like Michelle, in some cases former looked-after children, who've become marginalised in society. Many of them end up with mental health problems. Many of them end up in prison. And I guess a challenge to you would be, do your arrangements for meeting the needs of vulnerable adults in emergencies Are they sufficiently flexible to cope with the needs of people like Michelle? Final case study is one from the USA, and it's from New Orleans and Hurricane Katrina. Again, you may have picked up on this one. It's had wide publicity. This is about the terrifically challenging set of circumstances which arose at the Memorial Medical Center in New Orleans. It's a hospital that's situated in the low point of the bowl, for want of a better word, in which New Orleans is situated. And it was a place to which quite a lot of local people went to shelter as the storms hit. And eventually there were 2,000 people there. That's about 180 patients, 600 workers, and the rest of them were local people gathered there. The power was cut off apart from emergency power, no running water, and temperatures inside the hospital rose to over 100 degrees. And it was 4 days before the evacuation of the hospital began. And the medics in this case faced some very, very difficult decisions. They got 52 very seriously ill patients, many of them bedbound, many of them only breathing with the assistance of ventilators, to move upstairs, along corridors, onto a helicopter pad for evacuation. And the medics eventually decided to go with a reverse triage system, in that the most seriously ill went last. Now, many of them died, and doctors faced criminal allegations that they'd hastened the deaths of some of these people who died, and the case raised a number of profound ethical issues. Now, it's a very extreme case, and one thing I've learned is that it's difficult to make policy on the basis of the most extreme and most difficult cases. But what this case raises for me is the question of just who was advocating for these most seriously ill patients at the time the decision was made to adopt a reverse triage procedure. So a question I'll just leave you with is, in an emergency in the UK, should someone in the decision-making around the emergency be advocating for the needs of vulnerable adults? Will that help to make sure that the needs are met and that how their needs were met was tracked all the way through the handling of the emergency? So that's another question I'll leave hanging. Should we have someone advocating for the needs of vulnerable adults in an emergency? Okay, I mentioned there wasn't a lot of research, or at least I've not found lots of research. Most of it's from the USA, very active body called the National Council on Disability, the NCB in the USA, has carried out quite a lot of research. And some messages here on the screen. Firstly, that people with disabilities disproportionately affected by emergencies because their needs are sometimes overlooked or completely disregarded, and that particular piece of research gave an example of bus transport being used for evacuation, which lacked a lift for wheelchair access. A piece of research later in 2009 by the same National Council on Disability took the view that people with disabilities were often grouped into one homogeneous population and then provided with instructions not appropriately communicated or impossible to follow. And again, an example here is of visual and hearing impaired people often unable to obtain information in the form they needed to access in order to be able to have a chance of following it. The UN Convention on Disability, Natural Disasters and Emergency Situations advocates that we should look at adults at risk, vulnerable adults, not as objects of charity, medical treatment and social protection, but actually think of them as people with rights. people who are capable of claiming those rights and making decisions based on free and informed consent, as well as being active members of their society. And you won't be surprised to hear that it recommends that the voices of disabled people, and this applies to all adults, whatever the reason for the grounds for their disability, of their vulnerability, ensure that their voices are heard at all stages of an emergency, particularly during planning and preparation. Okay. Just shortly before the webinar, I received a couple of very recent and very relevant case studies relating to people living in the community while suffering with significant mental health problems. I'll just give you the details of one of them, just to illustrate some of the points I was quoting there from research. And this is about a 66-year-old man living with paranoid schizophrenia. And he required pretty significant levels of support to enable him to live in the community. And this support consisted of him being visited on a daily basis to monitor his mental health and support him to live independently. But access to his village was impossible for several days unless you had a 4x4 vehicle. And 4x4 vehicles were only available where life was in danger. So it meant that this man's visits ceased. So he went from having visits every day to nothing because of the heavy snowfall. He felt too scared to attempt to access village shops on foot due to fear of falling, so he was running out of food. Now, Wiltshire Farm Foods and Domino's Pizza came to his help, and they were able to run 4x4 vehicles and provide him with deliveries. But for 8 days in total, this gentleman received no other visits and no monitoring his physical or mental health. So quite a problem for him. He was therefore at quite some significant risk, and if his mental health had suffered to a great extent, it's quite possible he might have needed lengthy inpatient admissions, as he had needed on many occasions over the previous 30 years. So just one personal example provided to me just by a friend quite recently of how heavy snowfall could have quite an impact on the care and health of an adult being supported, a vulnerable adult being supported in the community. Okay, so just coming to the end of my bit now, so an opportunity for you to interact with me in just a few minutes. But I'm going to close with some observations and some challenges. First question I'd pose is whether our local business community plans are keeping pace with the changing landscape. What I'm hearing in my work with local authorities is that they're quite fearful about the second phase of austerity, if you can call it that. We've come through the first phase, lost a lot of people, redesigned a lot of services, but there's more cuts to come in 2014-15, 2015-16. And there's talk of commissioning more and more services and delivering less and less. What are the implications for business continuity of that, what appears to be irreversible move towards commissioning more and more services? Are the decision makers who are making decisions about managing austerity and the cuts thinking about the impact on resilience and community resilience of commissioning more and more services? Because when those services fail or fall down, as they did in the case of Gloria, it's the local authority who then has the responsibility of putting alternative arrangements in place. So have our business continuity plans keeping pace, and have local authorities got the resilience to continue to deliver their statutory services, including, critically, their duties under the Civil Contingencies Act, as more and more services are contracted out following commissioning. Are we clear about the impacts of austerity on local resilience? Are we clear about risks? Are we mitigating them? Or are there, as there usually are, unseen or unintended impacts? Some more observations and challenges for you to consider. I think it's fair to say that providing services for our growing elderly population is an absolutely massive challenge. Local authorities are working really closely with their partners in health services to try and identify critical care pathways for people with complex needs, to try and help them to be treated in their own homes or as close to their own homes as possible. It's big, complex changes. It's a massive challenge. And I would say that ensuring the safety of this growing elderly population with increasingly complex needs is a size of a similar challenge to the resilience community. And I'm asking the question of whether the scale and requirements of this task have they been fully estimated as required by the identifying people guidance, and has the range of potential vulnerabilities in adults been fully recognised. Also interested in any good practice you've got. Really interested in how the resilience community, emergency planners have linked in with their adult social care colleagues in local authorities, with their colleagues in health. Really interested in work you've been doing to try and ensure that your information about vulnerability is as complete as it can be. It's never going to be 100%, we all know that. And what arrangements you've put in place to try and ensure that there are ways of obtaining real-time information about the needs of vulnerable adults in emergencies. So any examples of good practice or promising practice you've got that you'd like to share during the plenary phase will be well received. And the point I made earlier, is the connection between our emergency planners and our safeguarding adults professionals as strong as it could be. We've got lots of people from both of those worlds on this webinar today, so I'll be interested to hear your views on that. And final question from me is should it be someone's job to advocate for and track what's happening to vulnerable adults in an emergency? Okay, we're going to get into the plenary in just a couple of minutes now, but I'd just like to announce quite a recent decision by the Emergency Planning College. As I said, the interest in this webinar has been considerable. 94 people signed up from across the UK and across the world. Following that high level of interest, the Emergency Planning College has decided to run a national seminar in the spring of 2015. So watch the Emergency Planning College website and communications for further details of that. The college will be looking to work with a partner or partners to deliver that seminar. So as we go into the plenary, I'll just remind you of the questions I've posed as we've gone through the webinar. I was interested in how local health resilience partnerships were working. I was interested in identifying whether identifying people guidance remained fit for purpose and was keeping pace with the changes. And I was interested in whether you're familiar with the Gloria Foster serious case review, those of you who are working in the resilience world. Should there be more scrutiny of preventable deaths in civil contingencies emergencies? Do we take account of the Michelle Conroys? Have we got a full grasp of the range of vulnerable adults that we need to take into account in our emergency planning? Do we need advocacy for vulnerable adults in an emergency? And is the impact of austerity fully being thought through in terms of its impact on community resilience and its impact on the needs of vulnerable adults in an emergency. And finally, really interested in any examples of good practice. So those are the questions I've posed. So if you'd like to send any text messages to me, I'll be very interested in receiving them. Okay, from Donald Park to all panellists, do local health resilience partnerships operate in Scotland? I don't know if anyone can assist us with that from Scotland. Mike Gooch, reverse triage is standard policy in any hospital evacuation. Perhaps NH England should review this nationally. So Mike is telling us that the reverse triage that operated in the Memorial Hospital in New Orleans, which led to the 26 most seriously ill patients being evacuated last, and some of them losing their lives, is actually standard policy in any hospital evacuation. And Mike is suggesting that NHS England might like to review that nationally. Okay, that's all I've received so far. Remember that just to go onto that green tab at the top, click on chat, and then you can send me any messages you'd like on by text. Remember to make sure you send them to all panelists. Okay, we've got 37 people who've joined us today. I can see from some of the messages that the quality of the sound has not been as good as we'd like. Sorry about that. Hope you can hear me now. I'm receiving a text here from Lewis Barron. Commission services, should they not be required to have their own business continuity plans in place? Which is a good question. And how would we, I guess the challenge there is how we ensure through the contract process, the local authority's contract process with commission services and providers, that they have adequate business continuity plans in place. Sam Weller is saying that the guidance on identifying people who are vulnerable in a crisis, written in 2008, should be reviewed to ensure it's still relevant. Okay, thanks very much for that, Sam. The point from Lewis about commission services having business continuity plans in place. Any thoughts from anyone about how effective any business continuity plans that commission services might have in place, how effectively they're monitored? I'd be interested in any views you might have on that. I've got a comment here from Selina Cole, who's asking, do independent care homes have business continuity plans, and who monitors these? So it's a similar point to the question, to the issue raised by Lewis Barron. Alan Heaton, following a local workshop we held in Hillingdon, we identified the importance of activation, e.g. a major incident, local v regional arrangements, i.e. influence Caldecott Guardians, would agree that an holistic approach, including door knocking by police, is required. Alan agrees that we need to have someone advocating for vulnerable adults, and we would look to include this in the emergency control centre. So Alan there is proposing a holistic approach, or you could argue that's a belt and braces approach, including door knocking, not taking the view that any lists you have might be entirely comprehensive, and following and having, in addition to that, door knocking and other methods of communication. Mike Gooch is saying that identifying people, step 2, suggests we have lists of organisations who have lists, All very well, Mike says, but organisations' lists will be different depending on the emergency. For the NHS, a threat of flooding will produce a different list of people to a power cut, which is a very interesting point. I guess I'd say that you can't always rely on these lists being comprehensive. GPs' lists might not include all the people on their role, on their surgery role with learning disabilities. The David Askew serious case review, if anyone has had the chance to read that, that's the man from Tameside who collapsed with a heart attack after suffering abuse from local youth for many years, revealed that his doctor was unaware that he got a learning disability, and it is a national problem that GPs aren't fully aware of their patients with learning disabilities. Kim Hambley from Leicestershire Local Authority Resilience Partnership. Are other emergency planners finding it difficult to engage with social care teams for planning, responding and recovery? Any answers to that will be welcome. Susie Street saying, even if contracting processes included requirements for BCM plans, business continuity plans for commission services, are we confident these are adequate and robust? Who checks them? Good point, Susie. Ticking the box that they're there through the contracting process wouldn't necessarily ensure that they are adequate or robust. Points are coming in thick and fast now. From Karen, just a minute. Sarah Langston. We have a list of particularly vulnerable clients that we contact within 4 hours of an emergency situation starting, but struggle to find out about self-funding clients like Gloria I mentioned, or those relying solely on family carers. Any ideas? Real challenge there. No problems in engaging in Suffolk with the local health resilience partnership from Mike Gooch. Eleanor Nicol. I've seen in other countries stickers on front doors from the emergency services to know that in that home a vulnerable person lives and states the needs of the inhabitants. Surely we can get ideas from other places to improve the care in here. We need to keep up with the times, from Eleanor. Local authorities are not coping, she says. Karen Emery says identifying the lists of vulnerable can be fairly straightforward. The problem arises when this list... Just a minute, Karen. I'm sorry about this, but so many comments are being added. I keep losing yours. I'm going to get to you, Karen. When the list throws up 200 people, resources are then a problem to follow up this list. GP's lists can cover the flu jab list. A recent incident showed 6,000 people on the GP's list just under this topic, so that's a huge undertaking. Thanks for that. From Ellie Gattrell Smith, another question, how easy is it to identify locations of vulnerable people during evacuations if they are not on any list held by public sector organisations? Also, what are the practicalities time-wise of doing this behind the scenes, as opposed to door knocking and dealing with what is faced by those responding to the emergency? How long would it take in reality to go through the process of getting hold of the information held by organisations in an emergency? So in other words, how can we do all of this stuff quick time? From Shabir Pesavadi, the business continuity plans of commission services should be reviewed at the procurement stage. Organisations with good BCP plans should score higher than those with none or poor plans. Thank you, Shabir. From Mamta Malhotra Sharma, would CQC not review the business continuity management plans? A question I leave hanging because I don't know whether the CQC do that or not as part of their inspections. Alan Heaton, data mining is actually very good with modern GPS ICT systems. We just need to agree data release, says Alan, especially if some data holders are regionally located. So thanks for that. Selina, again, listening to the views coming through, suggests the Cabinet Office guidance needs a review, exclamation mark. Need to take into account the now. From Pauline Clark, the drastic change of the NHS landscape from the 1st of April 13 has seriously altered the command, control and coordination of vulnerable people data that was arbitrated through the previous primary care trusts with the local resilience forum partners. Clinical commissioning groups, which have replaced PCTs, now hold this remit with local health partners. But are they aware of the previous work, protocols, memorandums of understandings that were agreed? Sam Weller, can you please clarify why the Michelle case is deemed as vulnerable? She does not fit our local definition of a vulnerable adult. I could talk for quite some time on that. She probably wouldn't fit the identification of vulnerable adults by local authorities for services in any area of the country. But nonetheless, one could certainly make the case that she and others like Michelle are vulnerable. And certainly in the area I work in, Stockport, we've got a multi-agency adults at risk forum which looks at cases like Michelle's and signposts her to services which might be able to help her. From Sam Weller, it's useful to have an agreed business continuity template for residential care homes and home care. Good point. That if anyone's got a good template to share, that would be great. Katie Price, we've just updated our list of lists in Greater Manchester. Our team found that with austerity, most people had changed, and we were told more were changing. I can identify with that, Katie. The lack of stability in jobs means this is going to be an ongoing problem. Yes, it is. Sam Weller, with resilience under threat in local authorities, there's a credibility gap between policy and procedures. Paula Danville, CQC do not review BC plans. In Lincolnshire Adult Social Care, contracting team use a checklist, but this is not ideal. Also from Susie Street, hoping that Resilience Direct Mapping function will allow analysis of vulnerable people against the current issue, for example in flood areas. From Alan Heaton, responding to Michelle's earlier point, she would also be included in London scene. This is about Michelle Conroy. She would be included within the London scene where illegal immigrants are housed secretly in sheds, in inverted commas for want of a better word, hence the need to always make local inquiries in tandem with lists. And Selina Call, here's a very good care home template, and Selina has given a link to a website which I will ensure is circulated to everyone after the event. We'll make sure that a transcript of all the points raised in this really lively plenary session is circulated to all those who signed up to the webinar, all 94 people. It'll be on our, in fact, it'll be available on the EPC website. Another one from Mike Gooch. The Primary Care Trust used to be commissioner and provider service. CCGs are now only commissioners. The Health and Social Care Act does not allow them to retain patient identifiable data. Okay, I don't know what the answer to that is. I know clearly we're not looking at the CCGs full replacing like-for-like PCTs, so Mike there is pointing up a potential gap. I don't know if anyone's got any comments on that at all. Okay, well, thank you very much for your comments. I'm going to keep taking comments because they're still coming in thick and fast. I think the points that are being raised indicate the need for the national seminar we talked about earlier, and probably indicate that there's a need for some kind of re-look at the national policy in the light of the changes to the landscape. Ellie again, re-list of lists. We need to recognise the challenges of where that information sits. If the service has been commissioned out, the information will be with another provider. How good is the information flow between organisations? That is a very good point, Ellie. I would imagine that the information flow will not always be as good as we would hope it would be. It's a really helpful point. Sam Weller's coming back again. With the depth and speed of cuts to local authorities' funding, it is difficult to keep business continuity plans and business plans up to date. Yes. Far less using crystal balls, says Sam, and I can hear frustration coming through in your text here. Far less using crystal balls to know what might be happening in 5 years. Indeed, in scanning the horizon at the moment is very, very challenging as services are changing and adapting in response to cuts all around us. Okay, I'm pausing now to take a breath because the comments are just starting to diminish a bit. Lots of really superb points. Any further examples of good or interesting practice out there as we move towards the end of this webinar? If you have, it'd be good to hear them, and they can be shared through the record of this plenary session. Donald Park, even I'm just looking at private care homes, business continuity plans. Are those business continuity plans, Donald asks, ever tested alongside wider emergency exercises? Good question. I've never seen it in an exercise I've been involved in, is Donald's comment there. Lewis Barron, good practice no, I'm not going to pronounce this correctly, Lewis, so I apologise for that. CEREDIGION, during the storms and subsequent power outages in January 2014, the utilities company shared their lists of vulnerable people in the areas with power outages, which was cross-referenced with our social care list of vulnerable people. And that information from the utilities about vulnerable people is terrifically useful. My understanding, though, is that it's only those customers who choose to have themselves put on the list of the utility companies. So it would need, as you say, Lewis, cross-referencing with a social care list. Annette Crew, a national seminar would be useful, but meantime, we will all be reinventing the wheel in our own areas. A fair point, Annette, to try to capture enough information. I'll be taking these issues back to our local resilience forum meeting. From Alan Heaton again, Ellie's list of list query, the local authority would strive to aggregate lists using a major incident protocol objective, i.e. saving life, on behalf of all responders. Thanks, Alan, for that. Sam Weller again, do Care Quality Commission include verification of business continuity plans as part of their remit in care provision audits? I think we had an answer to that question earlier in the negative, Sam, but you'll be able to check when we publish all of this on the website. From Paula Danville, I'd be interested to know what people do with the lists once they get them from various organisations, and how they merge and sort them, and then what they do with them, i.e. prioritise door knocking. We activated our arrangements in December during the tidal surge, and it identified lots of gaps and issues. Thanks very much. Susie's just confirming what I thought around customers needing to opt in to be on utility companies' vulnerable customers list. This can present major issues, from Susie. From Ellie Gattrell Smith, who is vulnerable will depend on the nature of the incident. Yeah, very fair point. This said, of course, we need to be flexible enough to cope with a wide variety of needs. Not only is it beneficial to be able to identify those vulnerable people, we also need to know how we're going to meet those needs once we have those people in our care during an emergency. Another good point. Who does what? Who can do what? Don't forget the value of the voluntary sector. No, indeed, Ellie. From Kim Hambley, currently beginning the process of working with social care teams to develop an overarching social care emergency response plan, which outlines roles and responsibilities. Are any other local resilience forum or areas doing anything similar? So if you are developing similar overarching plans, I'm sure that Kim Hambley would be very interested in talking to you. From Karen Emery, if you merge lists, who remains responsible for the vulnerable persons? For example, on a health list only, and then the lists are merged. So Karen's raising a practical problem with what you do with who assumes responsibility for the people who end up on that merged list. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Again, really fabulous points, really good challenges, really good questions, and it looks as though there's a lot of excellent work being done out there, which we can all learn from. Which I hope will be one of the benefits of this webinar. Okay, We're coming up now to about 4 minutes to 1, so I'll be calling a halt as we hit 1 o'clock, but still getting 1 or 2 points through. Ellie Gatchell-Smith, again, would a summary of the excellent points and examples made by participants be able to be shared after today at all? That's a really good suggestion, Ellie. I wasn't quite sure how much stuff we get back in the plenary session. We'll certainly be making a transcript available online. I'll certainly speak to the Emergency Planning College about the possibility of developing a summary. It's worth bearing in mind we'll be running the webinar again between 4 and 5 today. As I say, we have a total of 94 people signed up. I think 37 people have participated in this first iteration of the webinar. So we may get some additional points in the 4 till 5 p.m. go at the webinar. So I'll certainly speak to the college, the Emergency Planning College, about whether we could do some kind of analysis of the points. I'm preparing a paper which form the basis of this webinar. What I was hoping to do was include the material and the points raised in this plenary session and the plenary session to come in my paper. That paper will eventually be published on the Emergency Planning College website as an occasional paper, so look out for that as well. From Paula Danville, could the seminar include case studies of successful use of vulnerable person lists of lists? Okay, Paula, thanks for that request. From Sam Weller, please exercise care. A warning note here: when using template residential care establishment business continuity plans are some are out of date, and badging by ADES, and that's the Association of Directors of Adult Social Services, may not be correct. So thank you for that word of warning, Sam. Okay. Oh, I was just about to start to round up, but I've got Shabir coming back. Good practice. I'm currently speaking to UK Power Networks to ask them to send out the priority registration scheme application forms to GPs and medical centres in our boroughs. What an interesting idea. It'd be interesting to see how you get on with the UK Power Networks with that, Shabir. Alan Heaton. Who owns the list? Point made earlier. Silver Group to establish tactical protocol under the gold strategy. Ambulance identifies priority. Fire the capability to rescue. Police to coordinate. So that's quite a complicated point made quite briefly there by Alan, but he is saying that it's responsibility at silver or tactical level to establish the protocol. Ambulance service then would identify priorities. Fire and rescue service look at their capability to conduct rescue, and the police would then coordinate. So thank you very much for that, Alan. Okay, it's just about 1 minute to 1. So can I say massive thank you. Sorry about the slight technical problems we've had, which may have led to my voice fading. Hope you have enjoyed the webinar. The comments received from you suggest that there is considerable interest in this issue, considerable concern about the challenges posed now and in the future, and some really interesting good practice which can be shared for the benefit of us all. So once again, thank you very much indeed for your contribution. Please check the website for a transcript of all of your comments, and I hope that my paper, which will summarise the points I made in the PowerPoint presentation and pick up on the excellent points you've made in the plenary, look out for that paper as well, which will be published on the Emergency Planning College website in due course, and look out for details of the national seminar in spring 2015. Thank you very much, everybody.